Today's episode is brought to you by Malwarebytes Premium Security. Protect your computers and devices from cyber attacks 24/7 with Malwarebytes Premium Security. And go to malwarebytes.com/lock-and-code for an exclusive offer. That's malwarebytes.com/lock-and-code.
Every single kid was on their phone. Every single kid. They were standing there looking, texting, again, sometimes texting someone who was within a few feet of them, and it was quiet. I think, again, as a former middle school teacher, part of that joy of school is the loud hallway and the knocking teachers out of the way a little bit and then getting disciplined for that, of course. I'm not saying this should be Animal House. And that was definitely lost.
This is Lock and Code, a Malwarebytes podcast. I'm your host, David Ruiz. Our main story today is about smartphones in schools. Last September, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law the Phone-Free School Act, which requires that every school district, every charter school, and every county office of education in the state, quote, adopt a policy limiting or prohibiting the use of smartphones by July 1st, 2026, end quote. But for the second largest public school district in the country, that deadline wasn't fast enough. So this February, Los Angeles Unified School District implemented its cell phone ban resolution far ahead of the state's deadline. That means that for nearly 3 months now, roughly 500,000 students from kindergartners to high school seniors at more than 1,000 schools have been prohibited from using cell phones, smartphones, smartwatches, earbuds, smart glasses, and any other electronic device that can send messages, receive calls, or browse the internet. Phones are not allowed at lunch or during passing periods between classes. And under the resolution, individual schools decide how students' phones are stored, be that in lockers, in magnetically sealed pouches like those made by the company Yonder, or just placed into sleeves at the front door of every classroom, away from students' reach. Los Angeles Unified School District board member Nick Melvoin, who sponsored the resolution banning cell phones in classrooms, tied the board's efforts to the emerging body of research that connects increased social media usage with decreased feelings of happiness, focus, and safety. As he said, quote, "The research is clear. Widespread use of smartphones and social media by kids and adolescents is harmful to their mental health, distracts from learning, and stifles meaningful in-person interaction," end quote. We've talked about this very problem on our show before. There is an alarming array of statistics that associate increased usage of social media with increased rates of anxiety and increased diagnoses of depression, ADHD, bipolar personality disorder, and anorexia, particularly for young adults and teenagers. And just a few months ago, a former director at Facebook claimed in a published memoir that the company tracked when teen girls deleted selfies so it could capitalize on such moments of insecurity by sending them beauty ads. Facebook denies this and many other claims made in the memoir. Today, to help us understand LA Unified's cell phone ban, the opposition it received, the goals behind it, and whether it is working, we're speaking with Nick Melvoin, a board member for the Los Angeles Unified School District. Nick, welcome to the show.
David, thanks so much for having me.
We are very excited to have you here because, like I said, we've discussed smartphone and social media usage and its impact on teens, so this feels like a very important update for us, so we're just going to dig in. I did mention at the top there, this Phone-Free School Act signed by Governor Newsom, but from my understanding, LA Unified was actually working on its cell phone ban before that law was even signed, and so my question is, beyond just complying with the Phone-Free School Act, why was a cell phone ban important for LA Unified?
Well, I will say that while I'm really appreciative of the governor's initiative on this, that we actually were first out the gates. And so my resolution was passed by the Board of Education. As you mentioned, LA Unified is the second largest school district in the country, but we're the largest self-governing. In New York, The public schools are controlled by the mayor, who appoints a chancellor. In LA, we have a publicly elected school board. And the board passed my resolution in June. Actually, that day is when not only did then the Surgeon General of the United States come out with his suggestion at the time that we should put warnings on social media apps and smartphones for teens the way that we do for tobacco and alcohol, but also the day that the governor said we should do this statewide. And so I'm grateful because that is a push that a lot of other districts needed. But we were, like you said, early adopters once the law went into effect and predated it. For me, it was something that I had been thinking about for years. I'm a former middle school teacher. I've been on the school board for almost 8 years. And so I spend time in classrooms every week. And when I do, I'm struck by the same thing. Or I should say I was struck. This has changed in the last few months. But I was struck by being in classrooms and seeing kids surreptitiously scrolling on their phones. And I always say when I talk also to teens, like I'm not trying to single them out. If you go to any restaurant, and I think we're all guilty of this too, you'll see adults doing this. And I just don't control adult behavior the way I do student behavior, or I would be doing this maybe more broadly. But you see them, surreptitiously scrolling under the table, texting when they should be paying attention. But David, what was even more problematic in my mind, it was not what was happening in the classroom, but what was happening in the hallway, in the lunch yard, and during breaks, which is that instead of interacting and playing sports or handball or talking to each other or sitting awkwardly, which is part of school, right? Is having those awkward conversations with your peers. Kids were on their phones. In some cases, sitting in a group, texting one another as opposed to talking with one another. And in the last few years, now that smartphones have become ubiquitous, it's been about a decade. And so we're starting to have this body of research that was reaffirming what I was seeing anecdotally, which is that kids are on them, that it's harming their mental health, their physical health, their academics. And it just seemed like, my job as a school board member, trying to think of the well-being of our young people, this was something that I could do to get smartphones out of their hands during the school day. My hunch was that we were going to see not only better academic results, but less referrals to the psychiatric or social worker, less anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. And that is the bet that we're taking. And I think based on the fact that New York City just followed our lead about a week ago, or I should say New York State, that this is an idea whose time had come.
You were mentioning here that you were concerned about not just what was happening inside the classroom, but also, like you said, during passing period, during lunch, that you saw a lot of instances where kids weren't talking to one another. Sometimes they were even sitting in a circle and texting one another. I'm bringing all this up because when we last spoke about this, the wildest thing that really put this whole problem into concrete terms is that we had someone on the podcast tell us that lunch was quiet now, that no one was speaking. It wasn't rambunctious. And I always go back to that anecdote, and I want to ask you again the same thing to verify or validate that, because it's so different from how I grew up. But was lunch quiet?
Lunch was quiet. Hallways were quiet. I will tell you, the first day of school this year, I was at high school, Westchester High School in my district. And, I remember the first day of school coming back, and the passing periods and break, everyone's talking to one another because you haven't seen, and this was again before social media for the most part, but everyone's talking to each other. What did you wear the first day of school? What's your backpack? What did you do this summer? Who has a crush on whom? And I was walking this high school and seeing the quad during a break. It was like a 10-minute break. Every single kid was on their phone. Every single kid. They were standing there looking, texting, again, sometimes texting someone who was within a few feet of them, and it was quiet. I think, again, as a former middle school teacher, part of that joy of school is the loud hallway and the knocking teachers out of the way a little bit and then getting disciplined for that, of course. I'm not saying this should be Animal House. And that was definitely lost. And also just kids weren't saying hello to, their eye contact. And then we wonder why kids are more depressed and more anxious and over-medicated and all this. And it's well, they're not developing these basic skills in school. Actually, Westchester High was an early adopter even before this passed. I was there in mid-August. By September, they had the Yonder pouches. And it's a very different feeling on that campus now where students are interacting with one another again.
I wanted to move back again to the cell phone ban happening at Los Angeles Unified. I wanted to understand what actually goes into creating a cell phone ban, because I feel like it's actually pretty amorphous. You can decide what is allowed, what is not allowed, and also what problems you're trying to address with the ban. So again, what goes into creating the cell phone ban, and what problems or issues were you trying to address with it?
It's a great question. And one of the things that I've said early on about this is that I wanted to also win hearts and minds, David, so that this didn't just feel like a punitive, like punishment. And to that extent, we were trying to do a lot of outreach with kids and with parents about the benefits of this. And we had early adopters. We had schools that have been doing this for semesters, if not years, who across the board would report that kids were happier, teachers were happier, they had to spend less of their day policing this behavior. And so we spent a lot of time understanding how their cell phone bans worked. We also tried actually not to talk about it as a ban, but a cell phone free day, just that like kind of a semantic shift of this is positive. We tried to talk about what it was not. Kids have access to technology in schools. We're a one-to-one district. Every kid has a device of some sort. We also, while we're trying to encourage and hope there will be a trickle up effect, if you will, to home life, we're also talking about 7 or 8 hours of a day. And so we also tried to tell kids that like this wasn't as dramatic as maybe you think, but we tried to win hearts and minds, and then we tried to work with the community. And in a district as diverse as ours, we wanted to see what that looked like. And we knew that at an elementary school, it might look different than a high school. And so the policy is clear that schools have to adopt an implementation mechanism such that kids aren't on their phones for the entire day, including passing periods, including lunch. And then schools have the option of adding to that parameter by before school or after school. So if the school day ends at 3:00 and there's after school sports or arts, a school doesn't have to make that cell phone free for that 3 to 5, but they can. They also were working with their school community, meaning the principal, the teachers, the parents, the students, to come up with an implementation plan. And the district, we gave them, if you will, like a menu of options, from the pouches to lockers to at the elementary and middle school level. If you just want to put your phone away or you just want to say you can't bring it, that's fine too. Because we knew that, this is different for 6-year-olds than it is for 16-year-olds. And I think that grassroots approach to implementation was helpful because we got buy-in. Out of the high schools that we work with, we have a lot that are doing the pouches. We have some that are doing lockers. We also have some that are doing off and away. And, it's interesting, David, I'll end with this, but I was at Venice High School in my district in the weeks following this implementation. And their policy is that you can't bring it to school. And if you do, it has to be turned in to a locker during your homeroom. So you basically give it to that teacher, you get it at the end of the day. And I was in a homeroom, and I think I only, out of 26 kids, 4 had turned on their phones. And one of the kids said to me, this doesn't mean that 22 kids didn't bring their phones. They're just off and in their bags. And I said, that is fine with me, because if this policy is forcing you, maybe you're not following it to the letter because you have your phone, it's off and it's in your backpack. But if you're then self-regulating, because they know that if they take their phone out, it will get confiscated. A parent or guardian will have to come get it. If you're skirting the policy, but you're actually being in some ways more mature about it because you're just not, then that's fine with me. And so that's been one of the most fun things about working on this with kids in my youth advisory council is at times thinking they're outsmarting the phone ban or thinking that we're some sort of troglodyte. I actually used to work as an Apple genius in college at the Apple store. So to me, this isn't about the technology. This is about the age appropriate stuff. But they'll tell me, that kids are bringing burner phones and putting it in their pouches. And I'm like, of course, rules are meant to be broken for kids, but the vast majority, well north of 95% of kids are complying. And that's what this is about.
I love hearing this approach here that, like you said, you understand what's going on, but the amount of, I don't know if it's right to call it wiggle room or leeway, but just understanding that there are going to be some rule breakers, and that's fine because it's still better than what we had before. It seems like there's a cultural shift happening, and that's still a net positive. It does have me ask the next question here, which is, with so much understanding in how this is implemented, how do you determine then exceptions, hard line exceptions to the phone is allowed for XYZ? And does that even exist?
Yeah. So I'll say, just to your previous point, even those little shifts in how students are interacting with the phones, one of the things I would tell students and parents is that there's this body of research, and I think this is confirmed by even adults, that if your phone vibrates in your pocket, even without checking it, your mind is distracted for 12 seconds or something, because you're who? And so for kids who might have said, oh, I'm not on my phone during class, it's just in my pocket, we know that that's taking away their focus and from instructional time. So just having it off in their backpack, even if they're sneaking in the bathroom during passing period and checking their texts, that is a big win in my mind. So I'm grateful that that's happening. I think we'll have that trickle down effect. The exceptions was an important one for me because I think the one that came up most for families or for parents was, what about emergencies? And, we live in a culture of shooting threats and lockdowns. And so that is the one where viscerally you get it as a parent. You want to say, I want to be able to communicate with my child. But that's also the one where every public safety official I would talk to would say it is safer in an emergency situation for kids not to have their phones. And when you think about it, it becomes clear why. One is a really harrowing thing to think about, but like, if there is a shooting situation and a cell phone rings or it dings or it even vibrates, it could give away a location. A second one is that if every school in LA, and I would assume every school in the country, has a safety protocol, and that is incumbent on the adults to follow it. And if you have every kid pulling out their phone in an emergency and texting 911 or calling 911 or texting their parents different things, it can lead to real chaos. And there have been real world examples, David, where 911 switchboards have been overwhelmed because everybody is calling when really like the principal or the teacher should call, or roads have been clogged and emergency vehicles can't get there because every kid has texted their parent and said, come pick me up right away, there's an emergency. So it's one of those things that you really have to tell parents, like in those situations, it is so much safer to have your kids not have their phones. And then the adults on the campus will have to communicate about those procedures. There's then another line of thought around parents, which is just like, I want to be able to talk to my kid throughout the day. And that's where I have to be a little paternalistic and maybe patronizing and say, like, you shouldn't be talking to your kid throughout the day. Like, they need to build independence and resilience. And like, there are ways that you can communicate. If you're going to be late to school, you can call the front office and say, hey, can you run a note to Johnny and say his dad's going to pick him up or whatever. But we shouldn't have this culture where, like, during the school day, particularly in class, which I had to argue with some parents about, like, no, you should not be texting your kid when they're sitting in math class. But also, I think that's healthy. And then where we are making accommodations is for kids for whom they have a disability or translation services for our English learners who need their phones. That's where on a case-by-case basis, schools are saying, like if you have a disability where you need to do auditory processing or something, then the policy allows for that exception and you're granted your phone for what you need.
This idea you were talking about here that phone lines and 911 switchboards do get overloaded, roads get overused. This idea that panic actually scales in a way that is detrimental to safety, I think is really important. I think it's really important, and it's not something I had really considered. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that again and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's something that, when you dive into it a little bit more, you go, oh, okay, there's a different way to do something here. I did want to move on to understand even the need for like a cell phone ban, because I think for a lot of folks, like listeners who do not have kids, it might sound weird that a cell phone ban is even required, because they might be saying, hey, shouldn't individual classrooms already enforce that rule? So help me understand how this new ban actually gives teachers and schools more power and why it's taken this long to pass rules like these across the country.
Well, I think on the need for the ban, actually, it was teachers and administrators who were some of the biggest advocates early on, because to your point, David, they were already trying to do this in their classrooms or in their schools, but without a firm policy. There was both a collective action problem, but they felt that they were spending a lot of time policing. So if you're a teacher who says you can't have your phone, but another teacher lets you have your phone, then all of a sudden you're the mean teacher, you're the strict teacher. And we had teachers testify at the board who had elementary school students they had to deputize as like snitches, basically. Like, your job is the cell phone monitor, like watch a kid pull out his phone. And so they really appreciated that. And what I said to teachers and schools is, let me be the bad guy to the extent that you need someone to. Say, this isn't a school by school basis. Parents aren't going to come to the principal's office and say, my kid needs their phone. Sorry, it's district policy, and have them come to my office. So I wanted to take the discretion away to make it easier for schools to do it. There's something the kids call, right, FOMO, that fear of missing out. And I think one of the things that was salient for students is, like, if one high school had no phones, but another school had phones, then, like, you are nervous as a kid. And I get that, right? You're like, what am I missing during the school day? All my friends are texting in the group chat, or everybody's talking on Snap, and I don't have my phone. And so part of my interest in doing this universally is like telling kids, hey, nobody should be doing this. Like, you can do all that. And again, I still think there are deleterious effects to social media outside of school, of course, but like, if every kid is under the same rule structure here, then you're not going to be missing out on that. And you can't say that, oh, my friend in the other class is texting me right now, because if they are, then someone needs to confiscate that phone. But I also think, this goes back to what we said a few minutes ago, which is that To me, if I had to choose, and I know this sounds maybe counterintuitive, between getting rid of phones in the classroom or in the hallways, I would choose in the hallways. And that's because it's the non-academic challenges that we're seeing for kids, the social emotional, the self-esteem, the depression, the anxiety that we're losing when kids are on their phones during that passing period, during lunch, during those little moments. And so that is where it wasn't on the teacher, because the teacher could enforce a cell phone ban. But if then you're walking down the hallway and every kid is on their phone, it becomes much harder. So that's why the kind of universal nature of the ban was so critical.
We've talked so much about the ban, about what you folks are controlling for. Let's talk about, the past roughly 3 months. Would you say the cell phone ban is working? And I put working in like quotation marks because there's a lot of ways we could measure that. But is it working?
I'd say yes. And I think I'll talk about the empirical studies we're going to do. But the best headline or the most gratifying, I should say, is a local news outlet that said, quoting a student, LA Unified's quote unquote, very annoying cell phone ban may be working. And I just thought that was great because, like I said, there's a lot of self-awareness I have here. I know. And I think it's going to get easier every year because if you're a senior and you've been on your phone for the entirety of your high school education and now your senior spring, we're saying no phones, I get that it's annoying. But the second part of that headline may be working is because schools and kids were reporting happier interactions, less referrals to the school nurse or the school counselor. We are working with partners to figure out a research component of this, both empiric, like the academic side of this, but also like those things I was talking about, referrals for anxiety and depression. We have a school experience survey that kids fill out, and we want to hear from them. Are you happier? And so, I don't think that we're going to see what this looks like overnight, but I think in my experience and my interactions and my time at schools, to our earlier point, lunch time is louder, hallways are more interactive, and I do think it's working. And I also think the fact that other school districts and states are taking this on is proof that this is an idea who's got broad universality. And it's also, David, one of the few bipartisan areas right now of like policy. I was at a conference yesterday where the superintendent of schools in Louisiana was proudly talking about following LA's lead. And we see Governor DeSantis in Florida. And this is one where maybe for different reasons, but it's a true bipartisan effort to say, at least in this context for teenagers, understanding the harmful effects of social media and their phones, that school is one place that should be phone free.
There are so many things here where, one, it's great to hear the results. Like you said, there's fewer referrals to the nurse for anxiety, for depression. There's more kids chatting and talking. They have these surveys they're going to fill out, so it'll take some time to see that. But I wanted to ask, what's just the biggest surprise, that either you or teachers or students, parents, staff, anyone, right? Something you maybe didn't expect would happen and is a welcome surprise.
I think that some of the self-awareness from students has been really gratifying. And again, this isn't going to be across the board, but to have, because I knew that I think the school staff was going to embrace it, which they have. And yes, there's some question about enforcement, but like we were just talking about, like it used to be so haphazard that now they really appreciate that. And they have the support. The other thing I was very clear on with the resolution is that the district centrally was going to fund whatever implementation mechanism schools chose. So they wouldn't be on the hook for pouches or lockers so I also knew that parents, for the most part, were going to be grateful because they're the ones I think most nervous about this because they're seeing the effects that social media and smartphones are having. The students were the ones that, I knew it was going to take a little longer for them to see the benefits. And I was at a school the other day where a student said to me, I'm so appreciative that you value the relationship I have with my peers to do this. And, again, I was like, will you follow me everywhere and be my hype man for this? But I thought it got at something. Like, if not every kid is going to be able to articulate that. What that student realized is like, now we see one another. Now we're embracing this time. Now we're not like, we can be, we might all go back to our phones immediately after school. I hope not. But like, at least for these 7 or 8 hours, we like are able to like be kids, even if that means a teenager and that was kind of what this is getting at, which is letting kids be kids again. So much of their childhood, whether it was COVID or the state of the world or now technology, is lost. And so, to me, this is part of a larger package of things like building resilience and outdoor education and getting kids disconnected from technology, at least while they're kids. So that I think was surprising, is hearing some of the kids already talk so eloquently about why this is important.
Nick, I just wanted to thank you again for coming on today's show.
Thanks, David, for having me. I really appreciate it. And, I hope that this inspires other districts and other areas of our life. I was asked recently, how ambitious is your policy? And I said, it's incredibly ambitious. If you're trying to change a culture, you start with kids. Again, this isn't about putting our head in the sand with where technology is. I think there are a lot of wonderful, obviously, uses of technology for kids and for schools. But if we can create a culture of kids who are less reliant, and that's the last thing I'll say, David, is that since writing this resolution, I'm a much more responsible phone user. My phone's on Do Not Disturb more. I'm trying to be more present in conversations with my wife or my family or my friends because I just realize, oh, wait, this is so clear. And so that is my hope, that this also trickles up, and that when kids get home from school and they're around their dinner table and they see their parents texting, they say, hey, can we have 20 minutes of just conversation? And so anyways, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. To our listeners, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe. And remember, you can read all our cybersecurity coverage on Malwarebytes Labs at malwarebytes.com/blog. Finally, our intro music is by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, and our outro music is by Woa from unminus.com. Today's show has been edited by our podcast consultant, Eric Johnson at lightningpod.fm. Thank you, folks.